pretty ingenious idea. We have to find out where these people are.
It's vital for us to continue speaking up that we must continue supporting Ukraine. It's actually in the interest of the United States.
This is the team to do it, and reconciliation is the vehicle in which we're going to get it done.
Don't think that you can just come in and bully us around and not expect a reaction from governors.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, Ukraine war milestone. 3 years ago today, despite what you might have heard from President Trump, Russia invaded Ukraine. We'll have some of the frightful numbers about that conflict in a moment. Today, at the White House, French President Emmanuel Macron met with President Trump, elbowing his way into these conversations after briefly European powers, whom Macron is sort of representing today, were excluded from peace talk deals.
We're working on deals right now, transactions right now, and in particular, the big one is to get the war stopped, whether it's ceasefire or direct to an agreement.
Also tonight, justify your job. Elon Musk's social media ultimatum to federal workers. Reply to an email with 5 things you accomplished last week, and if you don't, you're out of a job, although we have new reporting that suggests that's not so hard and fast. The deadline, for whatever it might mean, is tonight at midnight. House back in session. Lawmakers are returning to Capitol Hill after a week-long recess. This after the Senate last week passed a budget plan. Now the House begins to work on their own spending and tax proposal. Finn Gomez and Scott McFarland and Nicole Killian, what a show of force it is. All join me now, but I want to start here at the table with Finn Gomez. Control room, let's do these full screens we have on the Ukraine war. With your indulgence, Finn, it's been 3 years. Let's talk about some of the damage in Ukraine after Russia invaded. So, when the war began 3 years ago, Ukraine had a population of 41 million. 10.6 million Ukrainians have been displaced. Bring up the full screen, if you would, control room. 3.7 million moved within Ukraine. 6.9 million left the country entirely. There you go. There's the graphic, finally. It's good to see it there. Moving on, how many people have died in this war? It's hard to know, Finn. Estimates are very, very difficult to cobble together, but the best estimate, 152,295. Civilian deaths, 12,654. About the military deaths. Russia, we estimate, the global powers estimate 95,000 war dead. All the Ukrainians will admit to in public is 46,000. Again, those are probably undercounts. And lastly, the contributions from the United States and European Union countries, the UK and elsewhere. 183 billion from the United States, from EU and other countries, 145 billion. It has been costly in many, many respects. And today at the White House, a lot of things were sort of danced around in public, and the French president pressing the European side for the president to consider important dimensions if a peace deal is going to be achieved.
That's right, Major. There were a lot of long, friendly handshakes, of course, between these two leaders. This is, of course, America's longest ally, France is, and that was the long alliance was underscored. However, you could see the major schism here between these two. Right, on one side, you had the president who was essentially demanding much more of Ukraine than Russia, if you will, really emphasizing on these rare mineral rights as part of the deal.
That the United States wants access to.
Hundreds of billions of dollars, right, that are part of it, saying that he's nearing a deal there. However, as you said, Macron, who's really representing all these European nations, is essentially saying, hold on, like, stop a second, because we need security guarantees here. And Ukraine, he said, quote, I said a deal must not mean a surrender of Ukraine. Therefore, you're seeing this contrast and this major policy shift on foreign policy with the Trump administration.
And the president, that is to say President Trump, talked about a ceasefire. Emmanuel Macron said, wait a minute, a ceasefire could be violated. What we need is a security agreement.
Right.
With ways to guarantee it, with troops, peacekeeping troops on the ground, recognition of Ukrainian sovereignty, a lot of the things the Russians don't want to put on the table.
No, absolutely not. And, and we did see, like, over the weekend, some indications by Zelensky, of course, that he may step down if it means that Ukraine can join NATO, something, of course, that the Russians do not want. So it's still, it may not be, it doesn't seem to be as close as the Trump administration is indicating here. It seems there's a lot of allowances that the Russians would have to essentially accept before they get to that deal. So you can see again that there is a major shift here between some of the United States' longest allies here, and that contrast so emphasized, I believe, in a vote at the United Nations today, where the United States sided with Russia and Iran and about 14 other Moscow-friendly nations against a resolution
condemning Russia's invasion.
Condemning Russia's invasion.
Exactly.
That's right.
Very quickly, Finn, we have some new reporting on what this mandate or ultimatum from Elon Musk may or may not mean for federal workers.
Well, there's been a lot of chaos and confusion since this started over the weekend, Major. But we have, CBS News has confirmed a report first broken by the Washington Post that essentially the Trump administration is walking it back a little bit, saying that there was a call between OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, and department leaders, saying essentially that it's up to the agency heads to decide how to implement this Musk rule, if you will, and that it also doesn't necessarily mean that anyone needs to resign afterwards.
Or if you don't reply, you have effectively resigned yourself.
Exactly.
That doesn't mean what it said on social media.
There's a host of legal issues with that as well.
That's putting it mildly, a host of legal issues. Finn Gomez, thanks so much. FBI Director Kash Patel has promised sweeping changes within the Bureau, and they are here. President Trump has tapped former Secret Service agent and then right-wing podcaster, that was his second career, Dan Bongino, to serve as the Bureau's deputy director. That is essentially the one in charge of day-to-day operations at the FBI. Scott McFarland joins us now. Scott, the implications of this?
This is a chance for Dan Bongino to get his fingerprints all over the FBI. The deputy director does all the blocking and tackling of running the agency. You want to pick up a new investigation, you run it past Dan Bongino if it's a big case. Transferring employees, giving people promotions, demotions, budgets, all of this is going to go through Dan Bongino, who walks into the job with zero experience in the FBI. He and Kash Patel have never worked at the FBI, marking the first time in the 117-year history of the FBI the number 1 and number 2 officials have zero FBI experience. That's going to raise some criticism and some concerns, but these new director and deputy directors come in pledging change, that there needs to be change agents in there and that there's a mandate to do that. Dan Bongino is short-sold if you call him just a podcaster. He inherited the Rush Limbaugh talk show and that broad network of talk radio affiliates across the country. He is, I think, arguably among the most famous members of this administration, short of the president. He has millions of listeners, millions of fans who adore him for his adoration of Donald Trump, for his denial of the 2020 election, and for his daily promise to own the libs. He is now the number 2 at the federal law enforcement agency.
And he said quite a few things about the FBI, has he not?
He's been critical of the FBI in the past. He's accused it of being weaponized in the Biden administration. He was a champion of this recent effort to make a list of 5,000 or so FBI agents and employees who were part of the January 6th investigations for potential internal review. He supported that idea, but he takes over as a deputy director with oversight of those workers now, and he said he's doing it in the name of public service. Not without sacrifice, Major. He's giving up a daily podcast and talk show that has an enormous audience and likely generates enormous revenue.
Is this a Senate confirmable post, Scott?
This is not. Kash Patel was, and there have been critics of this appointment, including a former aide to Marco Rubio, with whom we spoke tonight, who says the senators should have asked questions about this in particular. Who's going to be your deputy director? Do you pledge to make this a former or current FBI agent? We know the FBI Agents Association, just before this was announced, said it spoke to Kash Patel and emphasized they want an FBI agent in this position, somebody who knows the workforce and knows this intricate and tricky ship they're about to sail down the river.
Scott McFarland, thank you very much. I appreciate it. The House of Representatives is expected, if all goes well under Republican leadership, to vote on a budget resolution this week. That we'll have to wait and see if they have enough votes. And if they do have enough votes, it will be a crucial test of that House Republican leadership's ability to unify the broad coalition in the House on the Republican side around President Trump's spending and tax-cutting agenda. Speaker Johnson spoke about this earlier today.
They'll get there. We're going to get everybody there. This is a prayer request. Just pray this through for us because it is very high stakes, and everybody knows that.
Nicole Killian joins us now from Capitol Hill. A prayer request. Well, that's putting it mildly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that says all you need to know, Major. I mean, look, the Speaker has to have a lot of faith if he wants to get this measure through, especially since he's already facing a lot of no votes, so many at this particular time that every time he's been asked today whether or not that vote is going to happen tomorrow, as we had originally been hearing would be the case. Instead, now we're hearing, well, we'll have to see how our meetings go tonight. Well, we're hoping to pass it this week. So that new catchphrase is this week as opposed to tomorrow. But look, as you know, Major, the margins are very narrow in the House, and there are a lot of personalities. The Speaker has made this point before, and so really trying to stitch this together and get everyone on board with such a large bill is a pretty huge undertaking. I mean, this is basically President Trump's one big, beautiful bill. It covers defense. It covers, border. It covers energy. It covers extending the tax cuts. It includes an increase in the debt ceiling. So, these are all things where some people are on board with those things. Others are not. It also includes really huge spending cuts. Ideally, they'd like to cut upwards of $2 trillion in spending, which could potentially include Medicaid. So that's also a third rail for some lawmakers. So again, trying to get everybody on board with all facets of this bill remains a challenge and will continue to be a challenge this week, hence the prayer request by the Speaker.
And Nicole, isn't it worth saying that of all the votes that House Republicans are likely to take this year, this one, whenever it occurs, is the most important because a budget resolution can't set the reconciliation process, which can get through the Senate with only a slim majority, 50 votes. You don't need a filibuster if you pass it. But if you don't have that budget resolution passed by the House, you can't move that whole process forward. And the process here matters. You have to have, or you certainly, if you're a Republican, want to avoid the filibuster process in the Senate. And the only way you can do that is to get the House successfully through this upcoming vote.
Well, that's right. I mean, it definitely gets the train moving on the tracks. And let's not forget, next week, President Trump will be here for the State of the Union. So, of course, it would be nice if he could tout the fact that his agenda is on track. So having that budget resolution not only pass the Senate, but also pass the House is critical. But look, House leaders still feel relatively confident that they can get this done. That's why some of these discussions are underway in earnest now, with a hope, again, of trying to get everybody on board. And what the Speaker continues to say is, look, again, this is about unlocking the process. This doesn't have to necessarily be hard and fast. Obviously, the legislation that will be attached to this reconciliation package is still up for debate and can be tweaked a little bit. The main thing is, to your point, get that process going, and that's what the Speaker's trying to do this week.
For us on Capitol Hill, as always, Nicole Killian, thank you very much. Germans make their voices heard at the ballot box. What the conservative German chancellor means for Americans' relationship with Germany and Germany's relationship with Europe broadly. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Centrist Democrats will run Germany's government as opposed to centrist leftists, this after winning yesterday's highly anticipated elections. President Trump celebrated that victory at a post online, writing in part, "This is a great day for Germany and for the United States," although he may not be talking necessarily about the governing coalition coming to be. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Friedrich Merz is the man poised to be Germany's next chancellor, and he has said upon this election result that he wants Germany to act and think more independently from the United States, asserting that the Trump administration is, quote, largely indifferent to the fate of Europe. Tim Ross joins me now. He's the chief political correspondent in Europe and the UK for Politico. Tim, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining me. What is, as someone in America watching this election in Germany, the biggest, most important set of takeaways?
Well, first of all, it's very important to note that Friedrich Merz, who will be Germany's new leader, is maybe the friendliest leader the US could ever hope for. He's been to America more than 100 times by his own reckoning. He used to work there as a corporate lawyer. He worked for BlackRock and likes the place a lot. In fact, he counts Ronald Reagan as one of his kind of heroes politically. That said, he is taking the job at an incredibly difficult time for the transatlantic relationship. And he's had to really reassess the role of America when it comes to Europe's security in the last couple of weeks in light of what President Trump has been saying. And he is now absolutely clear that Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet and be independent. His word was independence. We need to be independent of America in the future because he says America doesn't care anymore about Europe.
What does that look like, Tim? And I know that's a hard question to answer. The German economy has been struggling for the last 2.5 to 3 years. It's part of the underlying tumult that has led to the popularity of the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany. What does independent, strong Germany look like with all these underlying problems?
Well, to an extent, it's also about Europe, not just Germany. And I think one of the points you make is very important, and that's the rise of this far-right force, the far-right Alternative for Deutschland party, which is a real threat to Friedrich Merz, the new center-right leader of Germany. And he will be worrying that that far-right party will be after his votes and they will take over potentially. He's already said maybe this is the last chance to keep them out of power. And when it comes to the next election, he will be very concerned that they might take over. But when it comes to what it means to be independent, he's talking very specifically about defense. He's even looking potentially to a structure beyond NATO, and that would be a huge deal, really, for European security and for the world. He says that Donald Trump has been so unreliable in the things he's said recently about European security that the Europeans, and he will be a leading voice in this debate, need to look beyond NATO to potentially create a new structure entirely.
A new structure entirely, would that possibly mean, and I've seen some articles suggesting this, that if President Trump and the administration of the United States is rethinking the utility of the post-World War II set of transatlantic alliances, maybe Europe ought to beat them to the punch and say we're going to take care of ourselves in our own way and perhaps negotiate with Russia in our own ways, negotiate with China in our own ways, and define our security in our own ways. Could it go that far?
That is certainly the moment that if you're on this side of the Atlantic, you feel like you're currently facing. And I think certainly for Friedrich Merz, Germany's new leader, one of the things he's talked about is doing a kind of nuclear weapons deal with Britain, which obviously has nuclear weapons, and with France, so that somehow those two nuclear powers can provide an umbrella to protect Europe in the way that he thinks America won't in future. That's a very powerful, eye-catching idea, and it's one that I believe people in both Paris and London will want to consider, along with Berlin, in the weeks and months ahead. I mean, we're not talking about hanging around here. This is a very live debate right now. And the simple reason for that is Donald Trump's approach to Ukraine. And he has made it absolutely clear he wants that deal with Russia quickly. That has set the alarm bells ringing across Europe about what it means for European security and whether they can rely on the US at all.
And very quickly, Tim, what is the sense there about the future prospects politically of the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland party?
Well, I think they have had an absolutely stunning victory from their point of view over the last 24 hours. They've doubled their vote share since 2021. They've gone from about 10% to 21%. And if they carry on that trajectory, they're really not very far off potentially from winning and becoming the biggest party. And that's obviously the kind of nightmare scenario for centrists. And really, I think what will come now very much into focus is whether Merz and the coalition he leads over the next 4 years can deliver for voters. If they can't, voters will want to look elsewhere. And that's potentially going to be to the advantage of the far-right AfD in 2029.
Tim Ross with Politico, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
With Mitch McConnell bowing out of politics, at least in the next couple of years, potential successors on the Republican side, well, they've already begun lining up for the race to succeed McConnell in the United States Senate. A closer look at that. That's next right here on America Decides. Welcome back. The race to replace Mitch McConnell, well, it's already begun. Senate candidate Daniel Cameron, Republican, who once worked for McConnell, now he's going after him in a video that he posted today.
Now, what we saw from Mitch McConnell in voting against Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, and RFK was just flat out wrong. you should expect a senator from Kentucky to vote for those nominees to advance the America First agenda.
Hunter Woodall joins me here at the table. Hunter, it's fascinating to me. I'm old enough to remember when Kentucky, net was a Democratic state, Democratic House delegation, 2 Democratic senators. Mitch McConnell worked his entire career to change that. There were other headwinds, Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump, but still, it is a largely Republican place, and the battle to succeed him will largely be fought on ground to stomp on that legacy at one level or another.
And that's exactly right, Major. And that's what's so bizarre about this. I mean, it is true. Mitch McConnell is responsible for major conservative victories. He's an iconic conservative Senate leader. And right now, he is really disliked by large segments of the Republican Party. I mean, you've seen this now, the idea that, you know, Daniel Cameron, seen as an ally of McConnell, is making a video like this to distance himself from what
to
McConnell...
get the attention of President Trump. Exactly.
And, you know, in a primary like this, it's clear, you know, Mitch McConnell's legacy is not going to be something, you know, held up as a good thing necessarily, which is really, you know, telling, given what we're seeing in Republican politics right now.
Congressman Andy Barr and businessman Nate Morris also looking at this race, but Cameron's in.
Yes, Cameron is in. He's running. And, you know, it can't be forgotten. He ran for governor back in 2023. He lost Democratic Governor Andy Beshear, the incumbent. So this was something that they thought, OK, Cameron, you know, is the best candidate to take on Beshear. Losing that race, obviously, that was a bit of a setback for McConnell's hopes of a legacy.
But also, sometimes this happens in politics. You have to run once and lose statewide to solidify your chance a second time. So that's obviously what Cameron's thinking is.
You know, that's the thing. He obviously has that name recognition. He is, you know, he still has built those connections. He's always going to be associated with McConnell, though. So the video that we just saw, he's going to have to do more of that. And it's going to be interesting to see, do Kentucky Republican primary voters take that as authentic, or do they take that as political messaging?
Authentic or messaging? Oh, boy. In the eye of the beholder. Hunter Woodall, thank you very much. Democratic governors have begun sounding the alarm over President Trump's proposed Medicaid cuts. Next, New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham joins us to talk about what she says is a potentially, and this is a quote, dire situation. That's next. You're watching America Decides.
Medicare, Medicaid, none of that stuff is going to be touched.
Nothing.
You don't have to.
Welcome back. If you're listening carefully, you just heard President Trump say Medicaid is not going to be touched. However, the House Republicans have a plan, which the president has endorsed, that would cut some $880 billion from Medicaid over the next 10 years. This as partial cost savings to finance an extension of the existing Trump tax cuts. New Mexico Democratic Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham joins me now. Governor, it's great to see you. I mentioned the top line number, $880 billion over 10 years. Looking at the data, New Mexico is the largest recipient state for Medicaid assistance. 33% of your population, as I understand it, receives either Medicaid or CHIP subsidies. What do these cuts look like to you, Governor?
Well, it means that more than 800,000 New Mexicans would be under or uninsured completely. So we rip those health care benefits. For viewers, CHIP is the Children's Health Insurance Program. That's 313,000 New Mexicans. But here's the issue that I think far too many Americans and maybe some New Mexicans are unaware of. This cut is actually a healthcare tariff to everybody else. That means your insurance premiums go up. That means your copays go up. That means Medicare covers less. That means your prescription drug costs go up. That means nobody has primary care docs, because all of this healthcare investment is all connected. We're already losing hundreds of rural hospitals every year. Nursing homes are closing. Assisted livings are closing. People are on waiting lists with disabilities for care. It's all connected. So this is devastating to America's healthcare system. And I hope that Republicans in Congress, frankly, come to their senses. And it is another example where President Trump says one thing and then does exactly the opposite. He's not reducing costs. He's increasing costs, and people will die and just be sicker. And for the wealthiest country in the world, how sad is it that this is the place that we would go to try to finance tax cuts?
And Governor, if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is if these reductions in the growth of Medicaid go through, it will be a cost shifting to those who are not involved in Medicaid at all. Walk me through that, exactly what you mean by that.
Well, because Medicaid and Medicare are the largest payers together. Medicare's the largest payer. That's how hospitals stay afloat. So if you lose all that money in a practice, or surgeons lose all that, or clinics lose all that, or independent practices, because that's no longer available, you can't keep your doors open unless you cover that with making premiums and copays for everybody else go up. So I don't think enough people are talking about that. This absolutely would be the most expensive tariff, and it would go directly to Americans. Companies would have to pay more for their employees. Small businesses would not be able to offer health insurance as a benefit, and more practices in America will close. By 2030, already, with all of this money going in, we're going to have 5,000. That's going to be the shortage for OBGYNs. In rural America, we don't have obstetrics. You have to drive hundreds of miles to see an obstetrician. Think about what that does to most Americans all across the country. It literally rips a healthcare rug right out from underneath their feet.
Governor, as you know, in your state, the Medicaid reimbursement or the budget ratio is 83%, as I saw recent data from the federal government, 17% from New Mexico. Other states are 21, 25, some up to 30%. Why is the ratio so out of balance? Question one. And question two, if these cuts do come, could your state budget fill up some of that gap?
Well, my state budget is also quite heavy on the Medicaid side. And part of that is because, which is a little wonky, so one part isn't. Part one, New Mexico has a deeper poverty rate than most states. And some of the other high poverty states did not elect to provide health care to their citizens. We did. And most other states aren't encouraging more healthcare delivery. The healthier you are, the more access you have, the lower costs become. So what we've been doing here is investing heavily. So I build clinics, I pay for all of the upfront costs. We're doing that in behavioral health, and we've increased our Medicaid rate. So that's the wonky part. Okay, that means the federal government also pays down a higher share here. Why would we do that? Well, Medicare pays the lowest rates in New Mexico, which is where you have a little bit of movement in healthcare financing. If you don't get a high enough Medicare rate, you lose money on private insurance and on Medicaid, which means nobody can afford to be in business. That's an old rate problem done in the 60s. Maybe you and I can talk about that another time. That's 30 minutes at least. But we were penalized, I think, thinking that New Mexico is never going to grow in population, or I don't know what the thinking was. But in any event, you have to make it up in Medicaid, and we do. That means the state also pays much more in those rates. And I don't think that 70% average is exactly right, and it might account for some of the other direct general fund, but basically it's a 25-75 split. So the federal government pays the lion's share, and that's part of their commitment to invest in a healthcare system that benefits everybody else.
One other thing I want to talk to you about, Governor, is the Department of Government Efficiency cuts to the federal workforce. I saw two different figures for New Mexico, about 23,000 federal employees and 29,000 federal employees. Nevertheless, there have been cuts already to the Forest Service and the Park Service. What's happening in New Mexico?
Well, I think you're seeing that happen all over the country. There is a lot of confusion and fear. One of our parks, Carlsbad Caverns, which is a national park, is operating with 50% less staff. We've gotten commitments from some cabinet secretaries that that's going to get fixed. But let's also talk about why, again, New Mexico has so many federal employees. Well, we run 2 of the 5 national defense labs. That means that the nuclear weapons research, maintenance programs, and all of those efforts all happen here. These are not the employees that you want not coming to work every day. I think this whole thing with a wrecking ball, employees, Medicaid, these huge shifts in what you're trying to accomplish in terms or in the name of efficiency are actually very risky and very problematic. This is a state that invented nuclear medicine. This is the state that figured out nuclear weapons industry. This is a state where these federal workers have an incredibly important international footprint, and to just say 50% of you should go home is reckless. So we're seeing it play out in people needing uninsurance benefits, their spouses trying to figure out what they do. And remember, their spouses are our doctors, our teachers, our police officers. So this has this ripple negative impact it has on all states, including this one. We're still trying to actually assess, but we've reached out to as many employees indirectly, right? So it's marketing and messaging, because I don't know exactly who you are unless you call us, to try to provide both state benefits and re-navigation of this workforce. So maybe this is what I need to say. I want you all to stay in New Mexico. You are valued here. You are critical to this nation's security, and we will do everything in our power to make sure that we continue to do our patriotic job to that end. And whatever the state can do, it will do.
New Mexico's Democratic Governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham. Governor, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Major.
The Senate's plan is in place. Now it's up to Speaker Mike Johnson. Can he deliver for President Trump on his agenda? We're going to look at that next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. It's great to have you with us. House Speaker Mike Johnson outwardly has a very mild-mannered temperament, but I guarantee you, behind the scenes, he is working feverishly to gather support for President Trump's endorsed budget proposal, which may come to a vote in the House this week. He spoke about the prospects for that earlier today.
We believe we'll have the votes. I've got a handful of people to talk to about various issues tonight, but we're moving forward and we're very optimistic we'll get this thing done.
I want to bring in our reporter panel. Mario Parker is here with me at the table. He's the managing editor on the U.S. economy and government beat for Bloomberg News. Daniela Diaz is a congressional reporter for Notice on Capitol Hill. Daniela, let me start with you. Sketch out the week ahead for the Speaker Johnson and assembled House Republican leaders on this massively important vote.
Major Speaker Mike Johnson is hoping to put that budget resolution, that one big, beautiful bill, as we've heard it referred to again and again on Capitol Hill, tomorrow evening for a vote. But as of now, he does not have the votes and enough support to be able to pass that budget resolution measure that is crucial to enacting Trump's massive agenda. I was just outside the Speaker's office talking to Republicans as they come in and out while they meet with the Speaker to try to get more specifics from him on what these specific cuts could look like. Specifically, a lot of Republicans concerned about the $880 billion that the House Energy and Commerce Committee is supposed to find in cuts, which could potentially affect Medicaid, SNAP. That is the concern that we're hearing from Republicans for why they are not supporting this measure, one of them being, of course, Nicole Maliotakis of New York. She was just entering the Speaker's office to ask him for details, and this is playing out in real time. They're meeting as we speak to try to figure out, as Speaker Johnson is whipping up the votes to see if he can pass this measure in 24 hours, and Republicans trying to get assurances from him.
And SNAP is not something you do with your fingers. That Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, otherwise known as food stamps. Mario, I want to ask you a couple of macroeconomic questions because it sort of hovers over this House Republican consideration. In the last week, the Dow was down 2.3%, the S&P down 2.3%, NASDAQ down 1.5%. Consumer confidence readings last week expect higher unemployment, that is consumers. Their confidence fell by 10%, consumer confidence in the future of the U.S. economy, and expectations for inflation grew. These are not promising signs for where the economy just feels volatile, a little up in the air. And that's kind of a backdrop for this big vote in the House this week, or whenever it happens.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that was the thesis in which voters sent Donald Trump back to the White House, right? They overlooked everything else that was going on.
He alone can fix it.
Yes, exactly. He was supposed to bring down prices on day one. We've seen him kind of pivot away from that. Eggs have dominated the conversation as well. Consumers are gloomy, as you just outlined. And while Trump isn't up for a second term, these Republicans, particularly those in moderate districts, are looking ahead to 2026, and they're also facing these angry voters who voted for a better economic outlook and just aren't seeing that right now.
And that's probably going to be one of the House Republican leadership's pitches is, look, the reason you've got to vote for this now and move it forward is if you don't, things are going to get even wobblier.
You are seeing some of the Republicans say just as much, right, that this big, beautiful bill will be the rocket ship to ignite essentially Donald Trump's second term economic agenda. But again, what you're also seeing is some skepticism here where the rubber meets the road. Again, just looking at some of the comments from these moderate Republicans who are saying things like, at what point do some of these cuts start to hit the bone?
Danielle, to that point that Mario just made, in your conversations on the Hill, and I know the House Republicans are just getting back to town, they were back home last week, is there anything combining anxiety for some with Medicaid cuts and what is happening through Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency and federal workforce reductions that's creating sort of a dual anxiety?
Well, we saw major Republicans, when they were back in their districts, face angry voters at town halls. I'm specifically referencing, of course, viral videos that have come out from Georgia Congressman Rich McCormick's town hall over the weekend, where he heard from constituents who were incredibly angry about what's happening here in Washington with DOGE, with Elon Musk sweeping cuts across different government agencies, and a lot of confusion about how this could affect voters back home, how they're feeling these cuts back home. That's one issue. We saw Rich McCormick tell a Georgia podcast earlier today that he believes that there should be less sweeping cuts, that there should be more, it should go along a little more slowly, what Elon Musk is doing here in Washington, D.C. But really, the bigger question being exactly what Mario said. Moderate Republicans want to be able to deliver wins when they go home in their tough re-elections. A lot of these Republicans who are sharing these concerns about these cuts don't want to go home to constituents who they need support from to win their re-election and say, I wasn't able to protect Medicaid, protect food assistance that's so vital to your daily life. So this is what we're seeing play out in real time. Now, I do want to note that Speaker Mike Johnson would argue and has argued behind closed doors as well as with reporters that he believes that this is just the first step of the whole process for budget reconciliation, passing this budget resolution tomorrow. Then the real work starts, which is actually enacting what these cuts would look like. And that's when those conversations start. So he's really trying to encourage his rank and file Republicans to get behind this by saying this is only the beginning, get behind this. And I promise these conversations will be important as we continue this process.
Mario Parker, Daniela Diaz, thank you very, very much. Testing the limits of the presidency. Next, our Robert Costa is here with more on President Trump and his somewhat aggressive use so far of executive authority. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Some Democrats in Congress have given voice to concerns from their perspective that President Trump has used executive power and used it in such an aggressive way that they have a phrase that they've used over and over: constitutional crisis. The Trump White House rejects that entirely, saying the president is following the Constitution to a T. Robert Costa joins me now. So I know, Robert, this is in the eye of the beholder, and just saying there's a constitutional crisis doesn't mean that there is one. But as you talk to people about this subject, it was hard to find a proper alarm meter setting.
It's a fascinating topic for the early days of the Trump administration, Major. Constitutional crisis is a phrase we have heard throughout the decades in American history, perhaps most recently in 1973, 1974, when President Richard Nixon was pressuring the Justice Department and clashing with the courts. And now Democrats, mostly some traditional Republicans who don't like President Trump, are reviving this term. But who defines it? It's hard to say. Some people right now on the left and in the center are sounding the alarm, saying President Trump's going too far. Others are saying this is just a president using executive power within the bounds of the American presidency. So for CBS Sunday Morning, we decided to sit down with people with different perspectives to try to understand this highly charged phrase and to give some insight into whether we're in this kind of moment or not.
And if the president says, hey, I'm doing it, therefore it's legal, you talk to Jillian Metzger, who is a very well-known law professor at Columbia Law School, about what the guardrails are and what the limits of those guardrails might be. Here's what she said in part.
There's only so much the courts ultimately can do. If you really have an administration that is intent on violating the law, it's going to take not just the courts, it's going to take Congress, it's going to take the states, it's going to take the people standing up and making it clear they're not going to stand for that, for our constitutional order to be preserved.
And of course, Robert, the source of some of this alarm is the efforts to shrink the size of the federal government or the federal workforce and ignore things that Congress has already allocated money for and authorized, which leads people to say, well, is the president trying to ignore the will of Congress or using executive power outside of the traditional understanding of the limits of presidential power? All this is sort of in play right now.
That's exactly right, Major. There is concern among some legal analysts about the power of Congress, or perhaps the lack thereof. They see Congress in recent decades as an institution that is failing in terms of its placement in American constitutional order. Many legal analysts have said Congress needs to be a check on the executive in a significant and frequent way, and they don't see Congress doing that now. Of course, Congress is controlled by Republicans. Many of these Republicans in this current congressional makeup are very much allied with President Trump. And this all comes as the conservative movement has really started to convene around Trump and the idea of an empowered executive in recent years. And you've seen on the Supreme Court, for example, a real push to give the executive more power, most notably with its ruling last year that when it comes to most official acts, presidents are immune from prosecution.
And you talked to Don McGahn, who was White House counsel in the first Trump administration. He's been in the room. He understands President Trump's orientation to these various executive powers. And you asked him, what would you say to people who are a little on the high end of the freak-out scale, if I could say that? Here's what he had to offer.
What's your message to Americans who are feeling whiplash with everything that's happening?
Calm down. That's my message. Calm down. It's a process. It's a lot of paper. It's a lot of executive orders. It's a lot of hype. There's a process in place. People are going to go to court. Courts will sort it out. Congress can help sort it out. We'll see what comes out at the end. But this is how our system works.
The thing I heard there that pricked my ear the most was there's a lot of hype. Like, some of this stuff sounds more all-encompassing than it actually is when you look at what's on the paper.
And McGahn was someone I thought was important to talk to because he wasn't just some conservative voice.
Right.
This was someone who was in the room with President Trump in 2017, 2018, when then President Trump, now again President Trump, was making these nominations to overhaul not only the Supreme Court, but the federal judiciary, and really pushing the courts to the right to allow Trump, now as president once again, as the 47th president, to push the limits of what the presidency can do. And you see that there has been a movement afoot for over a decade now to put Trump in a position now as president of the United States to issue these executive orders and perhaps have them stick. And this is a new moment in American legal history and American political history all at the same time.
And you studied it very carefully. Robert Costa, we'll have you back.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern, the Daily Report. That starts right now.